Welcome to the Tea Grannies. I'm Elise.
And I'm Maria. Today we're going to discuss multiple points of view, so pour yourself a cup of tea and let's get started.
Quick disclaimer for our listeners, we had some audio technical difficulties for this episode, so there's a little bit of crackling. Might not be able to cut it all out, but we're doing our best to polish it up for you guys.
Yes, please still love us.
Thanks for bearing with us. Prologue. Over ancient trees and older dirt, the blue-gray of first night treks across the sky and living things jostle about, finding their places for the dark. Among them, a crow blends into the wall of trees that guards the night things from mortals. As though he has no place to go in a hurry, the crow lengthens his forelimbs in a slow, lazy stretch. His wings nearly reach the full distance between the two trees crowded close to his perch. Late light bleeds through his inky black plume and shows off translucent shadows that wisp over the span of his feathers. A broken line of lightning appears in the sky. Wings snap back to the crow's body. The movement is so fast that nearby leaves remain motionless, giving no indication that the crow has shifted. Sending a steadying eye toward the hill, he blinks at the change in front of him. Where there was once empty space, now stand two strangers to the land. Both wear thick cloaks with hoods pulled up, casting shadows over their faces. The taller of the two, the researcher, pulls back his hood and surveys the land, shielding his eyes. He turns to the mechanic and pulls her hood down with shaking fingers. "We did it," the researcher whispers, and his lips break wide with a smile. The mechanic stares at the unusual emotional display, and then looks into the woodlands. They stand in silence, monitoring the surrounding land, only moving to turn their bodies round in their inspection. The tree wall pulls their eyes the longest. They squint their eyes against the remaining brilliant shards of light clinging to the sky, watchful of the twisted trees. The mechanic and the researcher observe while the trees continue to stand against the hill, as they have always done. All right. This is a prologue, and I feel like we have talked prologues to death, just in terms of, how we feel about them in general, so I'm going to try and avoid that with this. Right off the bat, there's some really lovely imagery in this piece, and I was particularly enraptured by the crow and its glossy feathers and all that the whole time. So really, really gorgeous work on that. The researcher and the mechanic characters are really interesting as titles too, which makes me wonder lots of questions like what it is they've accomplished that they're seemingly so excited and relieved about in this piece, and how they got those titles and what those titles might, how important they might be toward the story later on. And then in terms of actual movement of the story, the plot itself, I do feel pretty well completely in the dark about what the story is about, where it's going, what time period we should expect, or what kind of setting we're in, or even like what the point of this scene was, where is it driving us towards. Some of this naturally will be taken care of with, cover design, back cover copy, a title, all those things that we don't get with this first page exercise. So take that with the grain of salt that it is. But I do think the reader needs to be given something in the prologue. And currently we're not getting any information or expectation level for plot and story. Which for me, that's the danger with prologues, that I think often is what ends up happening is the prologue isn't clearly enough tied to the story. So then when we start with chapter 1, we're all just kind of confused about what just happened and where we're going and why all these things have happened. So I think we need something that's a little bit clearer a little bit clearer directive of like where this is driving us, or some kind of context, some kind of conflict. Something is missing from this that would allow me to like get really intrigued enough to want to continue. At this point, it's just kind of meandering in a way that's not fully drawing me in. But all that said, the imagery, the writing itself is really beautiful and powerful. So there's definitely something going for you there, and some tweaking about like what you introduce in this first page in terms of plot would be probably the most valuable thing to look at.
All right. So, in comparison to Lisa's comments, I actually really love this beginning. I feel like with a back cover blurb, there would be enough information for the reader to get started. But that being said, it's only the first page, and prologues can be hit and miss. If this is a short and sweet one, I think it would be good because then the readers are not getting taken down one storyline only to start chapter one somewhere else. That's always my thing about prologues. Has to be purposeful if you're going to use one. I love the language so much that I would personally keep reading just to see what comes of it, because the titles of the researcher and the mechanic were super interesting to me. It gave me like real dystopian, maybe sci-fi vibes. So I was pretty curious about that. But yeah, I think we're in the crow's point of view. So the titles work well instead of names. So what I would kind of expect if I was reading this in a store is like that chapter one would pick up with either the researcher or the mechanic's life from their point of view. That's kind of what I would be expecting. So we get like a little hint and then we jump in. But yeah, I really loved the writing in this piece. The imagery was so nice. I think my favorite line was the late light bleeds through his inky black plume and shows off translucent shadows that wisp over the span of his feathers. Like, that could not be any more beautiful. That makes me want to go edit my work and be like, you sound like a preteen trying to write romance. That's what I sound like in comparison to that. But yeah, so definitely kudos for the beautiful writing. And yeah, this is one of those things, I think with a little more information, this might be fine for your first page. It might not be able to depend on what comes next, but the writing is super. And I'm very curious to know more about the researcher and the mechanic. So I would definitely keep going.
So point of view, POV. Basic definition. Not sure if it's entirely necessary since everyone's a reader or writer here, but that's just whatever character perspective you're writing from. So we can have dual POV. That's when you have two primary characters. You write from their perspectives and you don't jump to anyone else's head. You can have multiple POV, which just means your story jumps around between a whole bunch of different characters' perspectives. And a switch between character POVs is typically indicated by some kind of scene break, chapter break, paragraph break, but not always. And that's, I think, good to remember that if you're working with an omniscient narrator, you can head hop within a scene or within a chapter. You don't have to indicate it, and that can work just fine as long as that head hopping is clear and easy to follow. I've never written in that style, so I'm definitely not any kind of expert on it, but I know it does exist. And then just to round things out, first-person stories typically focus in on a single POV, although some books now will use first-person and still tell the story from multiple character viewpoints, always writing in first-person from that character's perspective. And I have many thoughts and feelings about that, but we'll save those for later. Maria's laughing at me on the other side. Yeah, so that's character point of view. We wanted to talk about writing with multiple character POVs. And specifically, I think we'll hone in on dual POV, because that's kind of a space that we tend to inhabit a little bit more. But we'll also talk about multi-POV. And to kick us off, there's no limit to the number of POVs you can have in a story. And the sweet spot is going to be different depending on the reader. We did some discussion about this in some of the classes I took in the last couple semesters, and it's really funny how everyone's just like, well, what's the ideal? Like, how many is too many? And how many is too few? And it's like, literally, there is no rule. And you can't make one. So why are you trying to have this conversation? It's... The things we get hung up on is really goofy sometimes. But yeah, Maria and I, we mostly read fantasy and romance, then have been branching out into sci-fi a little bit more lately, which has been fun. But romance is usually one or two POVs. Not usually more than that, I don't think. with some exceptions. And then fantasy and sci-fi often will showcase several different POVs, but that's not always the case either. Some fantasy and sci-fi can be just a single POV. Epic fantasies like Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive will typically have a massive cast. Some people love that, some people hate that. Some people like me, like, if you can make it work so that I can follow who these characters are, I'm fine with that. But I tend to read smaller cast stories than the large epics. And then I guess some fun little tidbits that I thought of is that I found mysteries tend to be multi-POV to get kind of several different points and takes on the whatever mystery is unfolding. Whereas something like a thriller, or especially a psychological thriller, will often stick to a more limited cast, maybe even just one POV to really get you stuck in that person's psyche, because it's all about like isolating you within that person's mind, because that's how that person feels. So that can be really, really effective. It creates that sense of isolation in the person's head. And then some thrillers will branch into other POVs, but I think they tend to switch less often and focus a lot more on a primary character than a multi-POV fantasy might, to balance things out a bit more.
It's funny, the debate of like how many POVs is the right amount of POVs, because it depends on the genre and what you're writing. Like something as big and sprawling as like Game of Thrones, and you do have to have multiple point of views. If you're writing something, like you said, like a psychological thriller, and it's like one of those, like they're in like the haunted mansion kind of thing, and it's like, is it in their head or is it real? Like that's a great single POV. It will depend on the story. A little contribution to that debate. Personally, the maximum that I can handle is like 4. Any more than that, and it starts to blend together, or there's too many characters that I just don't give a shit about. You know, it happens. But back to my actual thoughts on this. So different point of views can add depth to your story. If they're done poorly, then it can just get too confusing. So the main thing I want that I think about when I'm trying to decide how I'm going to structure my story is, whose story do we most want to hear? If you're telling a classic hero's journey, like, you know, Star Wars with Luke Skywalker, for example, you don't want a point of view from someone watching on the sidelines. You want the hero's perspective, or the anti-hero, depending on what you're writing. So that's mostly where you're going to decide what you're going to do. And the problems are going to be similar for each type. I feel like dual POV is significantly easier to manage. It's my preferred as well. There's always romance in my stories, and one of my favorite things is seeing how characters interpret each other's actions and seeing their different internal struggles and their different growth and how they grow together. So dual is fantastic for that. It's also really common for romance writers for this reason. So we get some of usually the main male character pining for the fiancé, and then et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I personally really like the dual POV. And yeah, sometimes single is just not enough. I just don't get enough of the characters of the story or the book, but it depends on the book, and it does kind of depend on genre as well.
Yep. The answer is, there is no answer. It's just, it depends.
But it's true.
Yeah. So multiple POVs, like apparently controversial, which is not surprising, and comes with its own set of challenges. And like single POV comes with a set of challenges as well. So this is not to say one is better than the other. Different people will prefer writing in different styles, and a certain kind of style might suit your story better than another, depending on what kind of story you're trying to tell. But the biggest challenges I could think of that I've encountered, whether reading multi-POV stories or writing them myself, is deciding which characters merit their own POV, which ties back to what Maria was saying about certain characters in large casts that you just don't care about, because there's a few that you care about more. And yeah, that's always a big kind of something I worry about when I pick up a book and it's like, I know this has multi perspectives. It has a bunch of different characters. Like, okay, I know I'm going to like certain ones more than others. And whenever I get into one character's head, I'm always going to be wanting to get back to someone else I prefer or a storyline that's more interesting to me. So deciding which characters merit their POV can be really important. I've also edited a lot of books where I question the inclusion of a character. Because while like they might be a perfectly interesting person, they have a character arc and everything, but they detract from the overall narrative and like the point of the story that the author seems to be trying to tell, so that the other primary characters don't get enough, screen time, for lack of a better term, which becomes detrimental to the book as a whole. It creates a distraction. It makes the reading experience less fluid and less enjoyable. It makes the whole thing take a whole lot longer than it needs to, and that can be exhausting for some readers. So it doesn't even have to mean that the character is poorly written. Like I said, sometimes certain characters are just entirely unnecessary as anything more. Like they can be a simple side character, and that's all they need to be. As much as the author or even the audience might love them to pieces, that doesn't mean that they merit their own, like, fully centered storyline, right?
Yeah. There's nothing like getting into a multi-POV book and you're on like the second POV and you're like, man, that character is like boring. And then the next chapter is in their point of view and you're like, oh no.
Their point of view or yet another character.
Yeah,
and it's like, okay.
And I'm like, oh gosh. Or yeah, like I think, okay, we get into this later. I'm not going to start. I'm going to let you keep going. Like that.
We each had a moment like that already. Yeah. Okay. My second challenge that I thought of was, and I alluded to this earlier, using first person and still writing multiple POVs. Even saying that, I'm just exhausted already. Like, do I need to explain why this is bad? Like, why it's a difficult reading experience? Some people are like, it's not bad. It's not good or bad. I need to remove that from my vocabulary. But I have yet to read a book where this works well and isn't needlessly confusing to me. Doesn't matter how much I enjoy the story. If you're doing multi-POV, please, for the love of I don't know what, don't use first person. Oh my goodness. I find third person is automatically clearer when you're jumping between different characters. And I think the idea behind this is first person lets you go really deep into the character's perspective and get into their head. And that's really great and can be, really powerful to tell the story you want to tell. But at the end of the day, people write deep POV in third person all the time, and it works perfectly well. And I don't care if you're doing first person and you put the character's name at the beginning of every single chapter. If you've got multi-POV with multiple first-person narrators, I will get confused, I will get lost, I will not notice a character's name, and then I'll think it's someone else, and then they'll say something, I'll be, wait, that doesn't suit this character at all, did I miss something? And I get so frustrated. Oh, man.
I am also out because I feel like if you're doing first person, doing the whole story in single POV is the only way that you can really get sink into that character's perspective and enjoy the story. If I'm swap, it's too I don't know. I don't like it.
Disjointed?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I think I've said this in another episode. People might think I'm crazy, but I'm not gonna read with purpose the chapter titles if I'm on a roll. Do you know what I mean? I want to be able to just flip and keep going. I don't need to check at the beginning at the top of the chapter for anything. I just want to be able to keep going.
I will literally I'll be reading for a good stretch and I'll turn the page and be like, wait, chapter 6, I thought I was on chapter 2. Yeah. And then I'll look back, I was like, no, I just missed the chapter heading, literally, because I was invested in the story and I wanted to keep going. And I think that's gotten me into the habit of just not looking at chapter headings. So when it's a character name, I miss it almost every time.
Yeah. I actually recently read a romance book that I really enjoyed, and it was written in third and dual POV, and at the top of each chapter the author had put the character's name, which was pretty much unnecessary, and I actually found it kind of distracting because I was like, this is clearly his point of view or her point of view or whatever. But I understand the urge, because if you don't put that up there's going to be someone going, well, I was confused because know what I mean? Like, you can't win with everybody, so do what's right for your story.
It's true. You're allowed to ignore everything we just said about not liking first person POV for multi.
I mean, like,
you're allowed to write that way.
That's terrible, but it's true. I mean, I think third person's a lot more forgiving for writers to write in than like first or second. So that's one of the other reasons. It's a little smoother to read. Put it that way.
Yeah.
So now some of the biggest things that I notice with dual POV or multiple point of view, getting the voice right is the hardest for each character. So when you're a new writer, every character is going to sound the same. I hate to break it to you, but that is what happens. Multiple drafts help you get there, but that is still, I think, one of the hardest things for a lot of writers to conquer if they're writing in multiple point of views. So you can, like I said, you could put whose point of view it is at the top of each chapter, and you should when you're drafting, because you'll be like, who is this again? But for the reader, I feel like if you're reading, you should be able to tell whose point of view you're in by like the end of the first paragraph of the chapter. Like, you should pretty well know in the first couple sentences whose perspective you're in.
Sure.
And this is one of those things, if you're writing generally in like fantasy, sci-fi, the dual point of views, they're not in the same area all the time together. Like, those two characters are usually doing different things. So you're following sort of two different characters, two different, like, the plot lines, and then they intersect, say. That makes it a little easier. But if you're doing a romance where they're, more proximity to each other, you do have to make sure that the voice is really, really unique. Otherwise, it gets kind of confusing. Anyways, onward. This is one of those times when the anchor us in the scene thing that I'm always harping about is really important. And this is how you can get your voice down pat. And that is what I think of when I'm starting a new chapter in a character's point of view, is like, how can I like really sink us into this character's perspective? And that's how you want to keep consistency throughout as well. You need to do that. So in dual, there's often a significant difference in the type of characters or sometimes gender of the character. And this makes the voice a little easier to tackle because you only have the two to deal with. When you get into multiple, I mean, that's a little tougher. Elisa's written, your fantasy series had multiple point of views. I think you had 2 in the first book, 3 in the second.
Yeah. I think 4. I went from 2 to 4 and then stuck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first book you get Nim and Jay, or Forrest and Jay. And then the second book you get Jay's sister, Forrest, and I think Silic as well already. And then in the fourth book you get those 4 again. Yeah. That's the biggest cast I've ever written. And it was challenging, to say the least. I think I found voice was less difficult because I had written book 1. I had established Jay and Forrest as different. And I had written a whole book doing that. So I was already I had differentiated them. They're very different people. So it didn't feel difficult. And then we had met the other 2 characters that we eventually get to hear more about in the other books. So I had established their personalities as well. And Jay's sister, like, she's a whole creature in and of herself. Like, she's something else. So her voice came to me quite distinct, probably because it was influenced by book 1 and how I knew her from that book. And that influenced how I figured she would talk about things. And then I guess I would say Silic was maybe the hardest. He was the most challenging to figure out, I think, because I didn't know as much about him starting book 2, and his storyline just deals with a lot more secrecy anyways. So it's kind of like that typical challenge of you're writing in first person, but you don't want the reader to know this information. But it's almost impossible. Like, if you're trying to, we've talked about this at length. This is for a first-person conversation, but, like, if your first-person character learns something, the chances of them not thinking about it when the context comes up is very, very low. So if you just decide to omit information that the main character knows, it comes across as such a cheap shot. Like, one of my biggest pet peeves.
That's a huge one
so
for multi-point of view.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think I had a little bit of that with Silic, just in he was keeping secrets, but I was trying to write from his perspective, and that can be really tricky.
That's when swapping to a different character's POV is very important. You have to decide when you're going to swap and how you can do it strategically and try to hide some stuff. But that gets so I like that approach better. In like a series, if you start with like a couple point of views and then you get a few more as you go on, I actually do really like that because by then you're kind of invested in those characters.
Sure.
And yeah, the author knows them better, which I think makes a difference too. So the other thing, I don't see it as much in published books. They've usually been through the ringer with this, but head hopping, that's a sign to me that the book hasn't been through enough edits. But this is definitely going to drag out your writing and editing process if you're not paying attention to it when you're drafting, like as much as you can. It's going to happen where, you know, but try to pay attention to this and beware of swapping perspectives mid-chapter. So accidentally giving us one character's internal thoughts while in another point of view. That happens a lot. And I do it too when I'm drafting, especially in a first draft. I'll be like, whoops, I forgot whose perspective I was in. So that's something to watch for. And it's helpful if you do it as you're writing and not try to fix it all later, because it's way harder. And if you're writing dual, consider where you want the information in each character's chapter to land in the story. You don't have to swap a chapter from character A to B to A and back and forth the whole way through. You can do 3 chapters in one point of view, 1 chapter in the other. And how you balance that's going to depend. It depends on your story. Kind of depends. Like the fantasy draft I'm working on edits for right now, my main female character is going to get more page time because it's really more her story. He has a story too, but hers is sort of the driving force. So she's going to get more POV chapters than he's going to get. But he's still going to show up because that's how I like to write.
Yep.
And I'm not going to say it for any other reason. It's because that's how I like to do it. So
there's nothing wrong with that. I think that leads us into my first, we're moving into advantages of the multi-POV approach now. And one of mine tags off of that pretty well, that with multi-POV, suspense and cliffhangers becomes kind of easy, in a sense. It's still challenging, but it feels like it's easier because, well, at any point, you can just cut a character's POV and move on to a different character. And you can do that at the least opportune time for the reader, and cause them much pain and agony that they have to now sift through all this other content about this other character before they can get to the resolution of whatever was happening, which makes it really easy to just, create suspense and cliffhangers wherever, at the end of every chapter, you probably could do it. This is definitely a double-edged sword, as I think cliffhangers tend to get overused and then cheapened in multi-POV stories. But the advantage is that you can use this to your advantage and switch at any point to great effect, especially if you have 2 POVs playing out separately and then you have them end up in the same place at the same time later on in the story. I'm a sucker for that moment in a story when 2 perspectives finally collide after a really long time. It just gives me such a rush every single time. But yeah, figuring out what order to put your POVs in and how many chapters back to back do you want this character to have versus the other character. I think you can do that with how do you want to build the suspense? Where do you want it to peak and then resolve? And you can intersperse your chapters based on kind of how you'd like that to play out. That can be a way to approach it. And then the other advantage I was considering was in the same way that first person, we were talking about first person gets you really deep into one character's head. Multiple POV gives you breadth and scope to the story that it just otherwise wouldn't exist, because with first person, you are locked into that person's way of seeing the world, and the only way you get a different perspective is if they talk to someone and are able to receive that someone else's perspective. But when you're writing from a bunch of different POVs, this creates so much opportunity for world building and relationship arcs and character foils. And it just creates a more dynamic and communal experience, because now you can show how these 2 characters who interact in the same space may see the world very, very differently. And this one thing that character A thinks is, you know, a highlight of their community and it works really well for them. It might be, you know, like hugely problematic for character B. And then you get to delve into like the politics of that or the societal factors that make that true or false. So it just provides that much more material for you to work with, basically, which is kind of obvious, but worth stating.
Yeah, I think that's why multiple POV works so well in like fantasy and sci-fi, is so that you get a lot more world building and like you get to see like usually the political landscape of everything a little bit more clearly. Whereas if you're in a single POV in fantasy, it's a little bit more like you have to prompt characters to like give you information, which can be a little more challenging. Yeah, I think I agree with Elise, as I do with so many things. I love getting when you get to the point where all the point of views intersect. It's my favorite. I get so excited because you're slowly discovering the answers and then you get to see it all come together. And I just love that so much. So yeah, that's probably my favorite part about dual or multi POV is like the different perspectives. And again, yeah, depth. I think it adds a lot of depth to characters, particularly in romance, because like the main male character, like in a single POV, assuming it's from the female character's point of view, is like he's kind of a bit, I don't know, seems like he's on a pedestal. It doesn't really seem like
this isn't like traditional male-female romantic relationships,
like,
as opposed
exactly.
to something non-binary just or
traditional ones. Is like, yeah, they just seem every time I read it in a single point of view, I'm like, no man is that awesome. That sounds terrible, but it sounds like sounds like when your friend's dating someone new and they're like, this guy's amazing, he's so amazing,
he's perfect.
Yeah, and you're like, except for all the things you just kind of mentioned though. The red flag, but okay. So I think giving us the chapters in their point of view is a great way to make sure that your characters are nice and relatable and human and like lovable, and that can be harder to portray in a single point of view. So also a great option if you're going for the morally gray character, an anti-hero. I love to see what other characters make of their choices. That's super fun for me. So then we get into pacing. This is, yeah, if you have a lot of story threads and your characters are not always together in your scenes, I think the pacing can make such a difference. Like a good multi point of view in fantasy is like we get one character at home base and one's on the journey, and then you swap the point of views and you can build and build and build the tension in the world building and you can leave people hanging at the end of chapters. Don't do it every chapter. It's not nice. So I think that's the fun part of multi-point of views. I find like single POVs are harder for the pacing. So there's only so much one character can be doing at once, I feel like. So that's my thoughts on the pacing. So I do have an example. So if you've read The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, which, you know, I've recommended on the show many, many times, it's dual POV, and I feel like that's kind of a must for romance or romance adjacent books. But anyway, I got an advanced copy of the second book, which is called The Undermining of Twyla and Frank. And I had like the opposite reaction to it. And it's not because the writing was bad or anything like that. It was single point of view. And I was just like a little bit underwhelmed. So if you find that your protagonist feels kind of boring or you're not portraying the big emotional moments well, then you might want to consider adding another point of view, because sometimes the single one is just not enough. Like, for example, in that book, I was just like, well, I mean, like, she's not the most exciting of characters. So the pacing really lagged because of it. And that's something, yeah. And when it comes to romance, again, single point of view, I feel like is harder to pull off. I actually don't remember last time I read a single POV romance. Honestly, I would have to look at like my Goodreads. So it's pretty common that they're in a dual point of view. So that's something to bear in mind if that's the genre you're going for.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to think. I think I tend to read single POV more than multi POV because I don't read romances often. And like, for example, I just finished Sea Sparrow by Kristen Cashore. She did the Graceling series. So this is book like 5 in that series. And I'm pretty sure all of them with this one included, are single POV. Like each book is from an individual character's perspective. And they're like chunky YA fantasy. So they're not short. And yeah, I think with fantasy that works because there's a lot more likelihood of kind of adventure and tasks and things that the character has to go do.
And I think young adult works better in single than
Potentially.
Yeah, I think adult books
Yeah.
seem to work really well in multi.
Do you remember is Adventures of Amina El Sarafi single or multi POV?
I actually think that one might be a single.
Uh-huh. And if it's multi, it was like a few snippets here and there
Yeah.
from key.
Yeah, we're mostly
But
in
I
Amina.
think it might have been single. Yeah.
And I love
Which
that.
worked really well.
Mhm.
Oh, no, because it was she's telling the story to a scribe and the
That's
scribe
right.
is writing it down.
Yes.
Which is a different, you've got a different angle on
Okay.
that, which is can be very interesting.
Yeah, that's a
as well.
fun way to do POV, but like not for everybody. I personally wouldn't tackle that one until I felt like I was doing dual POV successfully, at least. Like with regular characters, because I feel like that's something I would mess up. But that's just a personal thing.
I think that's really hard. It's really hard to do well. Like the only other reference I can think of off the top of my head for a story told that way is Frankenstein.
Oh yeah.
Which is, not easy reading.
No.
And that one has a multi-nested POVs at one point. Like, because it's a guy telling a story about a guy who tells a story about Frankenstein's monster who tells a story about his life. So like you get Inception on that one a little bit. Yeah, it gets a little bit complex. But that can be really, really tricky to pull off. But that's a whole other that's a whole other category of POV that we could discuss in another episode.
Not today.
Oh yeah. So that was advantages of writing multi-POV. I think we've kind of covered disadvantages with the big challenges we talked about, but we have a few more. So my main one is like the reader may simply not get to know your characters as well as if they were written in first person. It depends how deep you go on the third person side, because you can go pretty deep. Like you can have that intimate connection with third person, but it's a different experience. It's not quite the same. And you don't necessarily have the entire book and all of that real estate to make that happen. And yeah, it can be just harder to sink deep into their psyche. And especially if you, as the author, you're used to writing about certain types of characters, which often happens as new writers. We tend to write what we know by default, and experimenting can be, hard, or we don't even notice that like these characters are kind of the same. So then you start experimenting with a character, you're not used to writing about them, and it can be really hard to get into their head and do it effectively in a way that the reader will resonate with. So that can be, if the writer isn't confident and competent and doesn't know the characters that they're writing, that can be a disadvantage to multi-POV. And I would say like that was a learning curve for me with the Nymph Keepers when I switched from book 2 to book 3 and introduced some new perspectives, because I hadn't done I don't think I'd ever done more than 2 character perspectives before that. And even then, like I typically write 1 character. That's kind of all of my stories start there, and then I might add a second one, but I don't usually plan that from the start. It usually comes up later that like this character's not enough. The story's too much of this one person. I need to add someone else. And then, with the Nymph Keepers, I added some more because they became more interesting to me as I got to know them, and that helped me get into their heads and sink into like their motivations. But I had to do some significant exercises while drafting book 2 and 3 to get into those characters' heads, because I was so used to writing from the other characters that it was really easy to kind of forget to make them as complex. It was a lot easier to try and make them a bit more of a caricature of themselves and not give them the dignity and the benefit of, having that depth. So I think it's a tendency we have to like shortchange those characters because we don't spend enough time with them to get to know them well, because we have too much fun with the other ones.
That's such a good point. And then, I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little, but again, like point of views sounding too similar. If all the characters sound the same, stick to one point of view if this is tough for you, but keep practicing if you want to write in multi, and read books like Elisa's books where you have multi point of views and you can see how it's done. Okay, so anyway, if there's too many characters, you run the risk of the reader confusing who's who and who did what. This is where I get into too similar of character names. Your POV characters should have distinctively different names.
Do not start with the first letter.
Yes. Yeah. You don't need first letter. You don't need like a Maria and a Marion. You know what I mean? Like no, it's too confusing. Don't do that. As a reader, please don't do that. So anyway, so there's usually one character that people are like a little less interested in their point of view. So this is where I kind of say, like, make sure you're not just adding that character's point of view just because you like it. Like, it's your story, right? But it should still drive the story forward. If it's not driving the story forward, then you might have to, this is the kill your darlings sort of situation.
I think we've been tending towards this idea that, like, if they're not interesting enough, or if they, like, make the story drag, they should be cut entirely. The other thing to consider is, like, they just might not need nearly as much attention. Yes. And it's fully allowable to have, like, 17 chapters from character A's perspective and 2 from character C. You do not need your characters to have the same number of POV chapters within a single story. Like, that's not,
you're not getting graded on that. It's okay if you want to
even
change
even in dual POV, even in dual POV, it does not have to be 50, like you were saying with your project that you're working on. It'll be primarily led by the primary character that you have in mind, because they just, like, they have to do more to carry this story. The secondary character is still important enough to merit those POV scenes, but they don't need as many. And that's perfectly fine.
And that's what I think will work for that story. And every story is different, because I've tried I do the dual POV in, like, all my projects, and sometimes I'm like, this character needs more chapters, this character needs less, and that's fine. That's just how it goes. The other thing I see sometimes is, like, the wrong point of view for the scene. You want to up the stakes and you want to create suspense in your book, so you want to make sure you're choosing the right character to show that scene. Like, if I'm reading a historical romance, for example, and our main male character is, like, viewing the argument between, like, the love interest and her family, for example, like, I don't really want to be in his head observing that in that scene. There's not enough of an emotional punch. The stakes aren't high enough for him. Like, I want to be in her head, the love interest head, which the one that's having,
unless he's planning to, like, step in and then
and do something really, like,
consequences
romantic and sweeping and cool. But if that's not happening, so whoever has the most to either learn or gain or lose should be the point of view character in the scene. Okay. And then the unnecessary point of view, also seen this Game of Thrones. That side character should sometimes just be a side character, because if you've written a story with, like, 6 point of views, you gotta ask yourself which ones are really important and which ones are crucial. And I will say, still a great writing exercise when you're stuck is to write a scene from a different character's point of view, so you can totally still do that, just not all of those need to make the cut.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. That's a tough one, though, because we're like, oh, man, I really like this one. But if it's, like, one scene out of, like, 100,000 word book, like, I mean, you got to cut it.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said for less is more.
Yes.
Like, sometimes a side character that gets very little attention ends up being, like, one of the most beloved characters in a fandom of a story. For whatever reason, people latch onto it. Like, you don't have to include all of the information for people to get how important this character is or how much you like them. You might not need as much as you think you do, because people pick up on that.
You can love them from the other point of views. They're still going to get page time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they just don't need their own point of view.
Exactly. Yeah. So to wrap up, we are, as is tradition at this point, going to provide some book recommendations for where we've seen multi-POV done really, really well. And I get to start. So I reined myself in for this, and I'd like everyone to acknowledge and applaud me from the safety.
You do get a gold star for this, by the way.
Thank you. I only have 3, and I think that's amazing. So the first one is The Blighted Stars. And honestly, I just really wanted a chance to recommend a good sci-fi novel because I don't read as much of that.
Blighted Stars is
it happens
so good.
to be, yeah, it happens to be multi-POV, done incredibly well. And I think one of the flags for me that it was done so well is like we couldn't remember if this book for a time was dual POV or multi POV.
Yeah.
And it's because the perspectives were written so well and were so, intentionally included that even though I was most invested in the main romance between two of the main characters, the other characters that we read from were important and valuable. And I never once started a chapter where I was like, oh, it's this guy again. I want to get back to, my main duo over there.
Right? When we would
I
get
never
into
had
one of those
that
other
reaction.
characters, I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen now?
Yeah. It was always absolutely crucial. And this is information we need or backstory we need or something that just added so much depth to what was going on in the main timeline that we were so invested in or showed what was happening elsewhere while these two were, off flirting with each other and drastically.
Gosh, it was such a
ways.
Great audio book too, by the way. If you want to listen to the audio, I really enjoyed the audio for that one. And now I'll be quiet and let you talk about the rest of your books.
Okay, so we have fangirled about The Blighted Stars. I don't have the author written down, but The Blighted Stars.
It's Megan O'Keefe, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that sounds right. And then my next one, and be warned if you get overwhelmed by large casts and or hate when characters get one scene from their POV and then they never show up again. Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive series. In my opinion, Sanderson does multi-POV exceptionally well in this series in particular. So the massive cast does not bother me. And that's not my usual reaction. I tried reading Malzahn Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson. My husband loves it. I hated it. Hated my experience reading it so much because there were way too many characters. I could not figure out what was going on. And I read 4 of them. And they're massive. They are massive tomes. I read 4 of them because I was so stubborn.
You're so committed.
And I hated every minute of it. And I don't he's reading, I think he's on book 5 now. And he keeps telling me about things. I was like, that name sounds familiar. I have no idea who they are or why they did the things. And what, 4 books deep, no idea. No idea. Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive is not like that. I've read 1 through 4. Book 5 came out last year, so I still need to read that one. But I fully intend to. I'll probably look up a quick wiki about what happened and what did I read, because I don't remember. But when I'm into it, reading each book, I'm following the characters. I know who they all are. I know what the stakes are, what their motivations are, and it's just such a good series. And those little this character randomly gets a POV scene and we don't know who they are, and then we never see them again for the rest of the book. I honestly love those. It's one of my favorite parts. There's these little intermission chapters between some of the bigger arcs of the whole book, and you just kind of get a little scene into this other part of the world that has no bearing on what's going on, or maybe it does, and we're not really sure, and it's just fun little flavor text. So love that. And then last of my 3 is The Girl on the Train. It's a psychological thriller. I'm just giving you all the variety right now. And this one's multi-POV as well, but we spend most time in one character's head because it is a psychological thriller. We're trying to get really isolated in her brain. And we only get brief glimpses at the other characters' POVs, which is really effective at building suspense for where we cut and move from character to character. It creates this anticipation. We start to get some backstory that leads into the present, and it just allows for so much mystery and for just this incredible rollout of information. Very, very well done. I once again don't have the author written down for that one, but it's a big name that people will probably know, so it's fine.
This isn't even on my list, but I would like to have a little shout out for Gone Girl with the best POV switch ever. I had never read a lot of thrillers till I read Gone Girl, and then I was like, oh my God! So I thought that's really well done too. And that's by Gillian Flynn. If you haven't heard of that, if you live under a rock. Now, my recommendation, one of my favorite ones to recommend is A River Enchanted and A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross, which is one of the nicest fantasy romance duologies. And it's so beautifully written, and it is a slow starter, so don't be alarmed. actually I just reread it, and I did it on audio this time, and the audio for that series is also fantastic. But I was like, oh, I can't, like, I don't even like this main, like the main male character, Jack. I'm like, I don't even like Jack. I can't even believe I apparently rated this book 5 stars. And on the reread, and then by the time I got to the end, I was like, I love him so much. So firstly, well done for that. But also a great use of the multiple point of views where it's not overwhelming. Each point of view is connected. The world building is so beautifully done. And she has such a great talent for helping us sink into the character's head at the beginning of their chapters. And their voices are super distinct. So that's one of my favorite ones to recommend. And then I am up to date. I need her to put out the next book, the Saint of Steel series by T. Kingfisher. Masterclass of dual POV. She does such a great job of driving the story forward while giving us lots of internal reflection from the characters without it being too much of one or the other. I think it's a perfect blend of action and character in that one. And then another great audiobook, the Aurora Rising series by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is like a super well-paced YA sci-fi series that I devoured. And I know you're like, Maria, you say you don't like young adult. Well, this was the exception to my rule. The multi-point of views were so fantastic. I think there's 5 in the first book and then 4 in the remaining books. So in the first book, I was like, I don't know if I can do 5, but then, it was worth it. And all the characters are super distinct. And one that I think, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wonder if, like, because it's the audiobooks that were narrated by, like, you had a different narrator for each character, right?
Yeah, that one was a full cast. So each character had their own narrator, which also really helped, but you wouldn't have even needed it if you didn't have a different narrator.
I'm just wondering if that's why you and I like that series so much, because we both listened to the same audiobook, and that just meant, like, I never got confused about whose perspective I was in because the voice was always different.
And that was one of the ones I did buy a hard copy that I gifted to my brother for his birthday, and I flipped through it, and I'm pretty sure they had the character names above the chapter, which I think in that case, like in a 4 or 5 book POV, like that's probably a good thing. But yeah, like you probably don't need it because it's pretty obvious whose head you're in. But anyways, on to the last recommendation. Now, I haven't read it in quite a few years, but Elise and I love this series, the Daevabad trilogy, also by Shannon Chakraborty. She is our queen of fantasy. So there's, I think the first book is 2 point of views, and then I think we get 3, and then 3 or 4 in the last book. I can't remember. But I really loved that structure for that story specifically. And I really want to reread it. It's such a fantastic series. And that was one too where I felt like the voices were really distinct, so distinct that in the first book I was like, I don't like this character. It was another situation like with Jack in River Enchanted. I was like, I don't like this character. And then by the 3rd book I was like, I would die for this character. Like no problem. So again, one of the other really big advantages of multi-POV, if you're writing a series especially, is how you can take a character from being so unlikable in book 1 to being lovable by the end, because they get so much growth, and like you get to see
character development.
Yeah, you get to see it as you go, and you really do fall in love with them as you go. So that's why I gotta say that's a fantastic series. And that's the tea on multiple POVs. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our Patreon for bonus episodes, writing discords, and more. Happy writing.